The Southworth Mills School stood on a hill on the south side of the river and served the children of the families in the area. I was 19 and it was my first teaching job, having just graduated from Westfield Normal School. I loved teaching there. I lived in Dana and drove to the school every day. I started each day having the students do a warm-up exercise, but I usually broke down in giggles since I tired way before they did. I was the last teacher of District 7 Schoolhouse. I wouldn't have missed this job for anything. Anna Elmquist Betts, Dana.
My father brought the wood for the schoolhouse and got the fire started each day. He also brought the water from our well. I remember the fun I had on the teeter boards. We played baseball and other games with our teacher. Charlie Johnson, Southworth Mills Road.
In the winter, we had a big toboggan that we ran down our own toboggan hill. The toboggan was long enough that Miss Almquist, our teacher, would join us on it as we went over those big bumps. I am sure it only looked big to us because we were so young. Ebba Carlson Robbins, Carlson Road.
The need for clean water was paramount to all developing cities in America in the late 1800s. Boston's development caused that city to start diverting water for its citizens' uses from rivers and lakes around the city, and then to build reservoirs to collect more and more of that water to ensure its availability. As the city grew, those stockpiles were soon depleted, and an ever-widening area was investigated as a source for that needed water. At the turn of the 20th century, the Wachusett Act took a valley that consisted of portions of 3 towns near Worcester to form a reservoir. But as more and more towns wanted to have access to the water, even the large supply now became something that needed to be conserved. When Worcester demanded to also have the access to this water so close to them, the state began to look further west to another valley, the Swift River Valley, to build an even bigger reservoir.
Our farm was the last one in Southworth Mills at the Dana border. With his horse Maggie, my father Victor brought his milk to Greenwich to sell. In the winter, Maggie pulled the sled. Charlie Johnson.
My recreation was riding horseback on one of the workhorses. I would ride him to Fitzpatrick's to get the mail. There were only 3 mailboxes: Virginia, Lyman, Howe, Lyman Road.
Although rumblings that the Swift River Valley could possibly be a source of Boston's water was heard since the 1890s, in 1916 the final fight for the valley began. In 1921, Hardwick added its voice to the opposition. Town meeting unanimously voted, "Be it resolved that the citizens of the town of Hardwick view with alarm the scheme for taking of the waters as an additional water supply for the metropolitan district, thereby irreparably injuring our town."
Parents, Clarence and Pearl Lyman, had a chicken farm and cows for milk. I remember gathering the eggs. In the early days, my dad used the horses to go on his egg route. Later on, they used a truck that they also used for hay. Virginia, Lyman, Howe.
The citizens of the valley sued to keep the reservoir out, but lost in Massachusetts courts. With the weight of the governor, Worcester, Boston, their legislators, and the newly formed commissions behind the project, the lone dissenting representative from Ware, Roland Sawyer, and the one alternative plan to site the reservoir in a different location were soon quiet. After living under the dark clouds for over a decade, the valley's inhabitants seem to seal their own fate. We feel it is only a matter of time before we'll be forced out. If the legislature is to act, let it be now, so we may plan the rest of our days. We have the rights and ask that we be made as whole as possible. Let it be swift and decisive action. Letter to the Massachusetts Legislature, 1926. The signing of the Swift River Act in 1927 sounded the end of 4 towns, portions of 7 others, and took the tributaries of all 3 branches of the Swift River to become what was the Commonwealth's largest reservoir. And so it began. Engineers came to survey and map the valley to the high water marks. In 1928, the path of the aqueduct to carry the water from the Swift River Valley to Colebrook and Barry and then to join the Wachusett was set, and the land acquired. Work commenced on the drilling of the shafts and the tunnels. Starting in 1927, landowners began listing their properties for sale, and in 1928, state agents were buying all property that touched the river or was to be included in the new watershed. All properties taken were cataloged and the houses and buildings photographed. In 1928, Hardwick voters gave the state a 3-year contract for a brick schoolhouse on the Common to serve as a field office. 22 engineers and staff personnel worked out of that location under the division engineer Richard Bradbury, with one stenographer, local girl Mary Thresher.
My sister worked in the office, so every night with our meat and potatoes, she would tell us what was accomplished that day. My father was much interested in the construction, so on Sundays we would ride over to look at what had been done. Leon Thresher, Thresher Road.
300 men came to the Hardwick office seeking work at the height of the Depression. Many local residents were grateful to get a job to work on the new reservoir, even though it meant working for something that the valley had fought against for so long.
I remember going down into the shafts as a youngster. There was a big hoisting rig at the intake and a drum to lower the platform. The guy in charge just released the brake and down you went. There was a big cable and pieces of cloth threaded into it, and big wooden levers were the brakes. When the first cloth went by, he grabbed the lever and started putting on the brakes. When the second piece went by, he grabbed the second lever and put on the brakes some more. Then there was a third piece of cloth. If you weren't stopped by the time you got to the third piece, you had a problem because you were at the bottom. It took 6 men to get me back into the elevator. I went down voluntarily, but I didn't come back that way. Richard Walker, Greenwich Village. Contract number 20 gave specifications for the work in the tunnels and the shafts, 10, 11, and 11A in Hardwick. The tunnel was horseshoe-shaped, about 12 feet high and 12 feet wide at the widest. At the bottom were railroad tracks. They had these little trains to pick up some of the stone after they drilled holes and set off dynamite. They had a cement plant for each shaft, then took the cement down to the line to the tunnel. Richard Walker.
I got a job at shaft 11A. When they cut the stumps, we had to get the dirt out of them. We were getting paid 40 cents per hour. One day my buddy Sully came and said that he wanted to go to work in Greenwich. We got out of work and an hour later we were working at Greenwich. It was a big deal. We were now getting 50 cents per hour. Francis Jaxtus, Petersham Road.
A storehouse for material was located at Old Furnace, and a road for supplies went from there to shaft number 10. In 1932, an explosion at the dynamite house killed a worker and leveled that building. In 1933, workers at shaft number 10 and 11 went on strike. After reaching an agreement, work went on.
Our farm on Southworth Mills Road was 41 acres, and on a dirt road 2.5 miles to Greenwich Village, 3 miles to Dana, and 4.5 miles to Hardwick Center. It sat on both sides of the Swift River, and we had over 3,600 feet on the river. The state took possession of our farm in 1933, but allowed us to stay for 4 more years. George Taylor, Southworth Mills Road. My mother, Ida Mae Moore Taylor, owned the remains of the dam which had produced power for the Southworth's grist mill, lumber mills, blacksmithing, and other factories. She sold the ruins to the state in 1928 and the house and barns in 1930. We had quite a few barns on the property. On the left was our ice house, then came the carriage shed. There was a silo connected to the barn that Howard Thresher bought in 1935 and moved to his farm on Thresher Road. George Taylor.
I visited my cousins Fred and Etna Thresher on their farm many times. After they sold their property to the state, Etna bought the buildings back. The state was just going to take them down anyway, so my cousin took them down herself and sold the lumber. The state gave the owners an offer on their property, and they had to take it, more or less, because the state was going to take it anyway. Harrison Nealon, Hardwick Center.
After the Johnsons sold their farm to the state, the Meisner family from New York rented it for the summers. They bought their milk, eggs, and vegetables from us. They had money to waste. They thought it was amusing to drop a nickel into a fresh cow flop to see if someone would retrieve it. I would wait a few days until the cow flop hardened and then pick the nickel off. George Taylor.
I went over to the Southworth Mills School after it closed. Someone had taken all the books and put them in the pot-bellied stove that they used to heat the building. My mother was very upset that they were going to burn them. Harrison Nealon.
A wooden bridge crossed the Swift River into Dana at the end of Hell Huddle. Today the bridge is concrete, the road is paved, and leads to fishing area number 3. This part of Dana was annexed to Petersham. Off Hell Huddle, Carter Road continued into Dana. The boundary of the two towns is still marked by a pole, but the sign that existed in 1977 has now disappeared. Past the Southworth Mills Road, where the Hardwick Greenwich Road met the north end of Fitzpatrick Road, several generations of the Hall family lived until they sold their farm in 1928.
My mom and dad came to Hardwick in 1928 and rented what used to be the Hall place. It was during the Depression, and Dad, who was a musician who played in Springfield and always wanted to live in the country. The rent was very inexpensive. We had a pig pen, and we used to pick blueberries and cranberries. We knew we were going to have to move, but we were able to stay there for over 10 years until August of 1938. William Jenkins, Hardwick, Greenwich Road. My mother was very proud of the fact that she was one of the first women to drive an automobile. My brothers and sisters often swam in the East Branch of the Swift River in the summer. Bill Jenkins.
We used to swim in the East Branch of the Swift River. There was a swimming hole, and above it was an interesting place with lots of rocks. We used to go up the river jumping from rock to rock. One rock I stepped on moved. It was a large snapping turtle. George Taylor.
My father used to often have guests from Springfield out on weekends. They loved to come out because we had swimming, picnics, and every Sunday we made ice cream on the porch. Bill Jenkins.
The Hall property now lies along the shore of the reservoir at the junction of what used to be Greenwich Road and Fitzpatrick Road. The roads are barely visible, and they disappear into the water at the reservoir.
I lived in Greenwich, but visited my grandfather at his turkey farm in Hardwick on the Hardwick-Greenwich Road. The original deed was from 1777, and my original Hardwick ancestor was in the Revolutionary War. My grandfather was very upset about the state's plans for the people with deep roots within the valley. It was a depressing time. The farm was very large, several hundred acres, but the deeds stated things like pine trees and rocks for the boundaries, and the lines got fuzzy over the hundreds of years. All the property around my grandfather had been sold in the past, so the state said that the hole in the middle was my grandfather's property. That's how my grandfather was paid for his land. They gave him $800, and the state considered that a high price. Richard Walker.
From the Walker homestead, there was a stone wall in the front yard, and then across the road was another stone wall. The property dropped off into the fields and down to the Swift River. Today, the land past those stone walls drops down to the banks of the reservoir. If you travel from the Walker homestead towards Greenwich, you would find the farm of George and Lenora Crary. They were an early family to leave the valley. Den Hill shadowed the rear of their property. Today, Den Hill is an island near the South Baffle Dam. What is left of the old road to Greenwich lies along the shore of the reservoir. However, the majority of it is now underwater.
In the fall of 1937, we left our farm and I never saw it again. I have never forgotten it. As a young boy, I felt it was a paradise full of adventure. George Taylor.
Taken were many back roads like Fitzpatrick, some out of use for many years, like the road to Captain Webb's home, and some long since removed from town maps, like the road to John Terry's. The more distant properties from where the water would rise were bought into the mid and late 1930s. Among these were Greenwich Plains Road, Hall Road, and Lyman Road. In 1936, farmers on Prouty Road filed suit against the Commonwealth, claiming the waters of Moose Brook were being diverted into the tunnels and lowered the levels of the nearby springs and their wells. They lost that suit in 1937, after the state cited evidence that the wells had dried up before the tunnels were built. However, several of the people involved felt that expecting witnesses who didn't understand English to prove their case or saying that the farmers were not being truthful showed that the state was not following the intent of the original act.
I never heard my parents say any negative things about living there. They moved there voluntarily, and they did not lose their home like others had. I still love to go there and stand on the foundation of our home. It is now only 60 to 70 yards from the shoreline. Bill Jenkins.
The line for the watershed cut through the middle of Frank Stogodis' property on Petersam Road. Even though the house was not to be taken, his daughter Agnes chose not to divide the land and sold it in its entirety to the state. When the final maps were set, over 4,600 acres of the west part of Hardwick was to be part of a new reservoir and the right-of-way for the tunnel. This included 138 pieces of property, the remains of dozens of older and abandoned houses, 18 occupied homes, one schoolhouse, and numerous farm outbuildings that would soon cease to exist. A 1931 article in the Barrie Gazette stated that the Commonwealth estimated that the value of the land and property taken in Hardwick was $15,000. The watershed area in the west part of Hardwick now has limited access, and gates block the roads that once went to parts of Hardwick and into Dana, Greenwich, and Enfield. The roads are a silent testimony to the past, as they now front abandoned home sites and disappear into the reservoir waters. In this 75th year of remembrance, we reflect on what was, honor the people whose lives were changed forever, speculate on what might have been if this had never come to pass, and live with what is here now.
The brooks around our house were only drainage. We were the last house taken on the road. If we had lived just a little more toward Hardwick, we wouldn't have had to leave. I still think it's too far away, and it wasn't necessary. Virginia Lyman Howe.
Today they call it Quabbin, and all the seeds have been sown. Those towns are gone, but memories live on, back when I called it home. Today they call it Quabbin, but you can hear the spirits moan. Today they call it Quabbin, back then I called it home. We once had a farm, pretty little farm, kept our family alive. Corn and beans and sunflower seeds, and old John Deere to drive. But Boston needed water, didn't care from whence it came. So they took our land, dug up our dead. Things have never been the same. Today they called it Quabbin, and all the seeds have been sown. Those towns are gone, but memories live on, back when I called it home. Today they called it Quabbin, but you can hear the spirits moan. Today they called it Quabbin, back then I called it home. Today they call it Quabbin, back then I called it home.